My daughter-in-law spit in my face during an argument, and my son said I deserved it. I said nothing and went to bed. Next morning, they woke up to the smell of pancakes and saw the table filled with treats. My son said, "Good, you finally understood your place." But when they saw who was sitting next to me at the table, they froze. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me tell you how I got to that moment, because what happened next changed everything. I'm Margaret Williams, 62 years old, and until 3 days ago, I thought I was living a peaceful retirement in my own home. My son David moved back in 6 months ago with his wife Jessica after they lost their apartment. "Just temporary, Mom," he'd said, "until we get back on our feet." I should have known better. David has a way of making temporary situations permanent when they benefit him. The argument started over something ridiculous. Jessica had rearranged my kitchen without asking, moving everything to places that made no sense. When I politely asked her to put things back, she exploded. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she screamed, her face red with fury. "You're so controlling. No wonder David's father left you." My late husband didn't leave me. He died of a heart attack 5 years ago, but Jessica has never let facts interfere with a good insult. "Jessica, I just want my measuring cups back in the drawer where I can find them," I said calmly. That's when she lost it completely. "I am so sick of walking on eggshells around you. This house feels like a museum where we're not allowed to touch anything." David came running from the living room. Instead of defending me, he immediately sided with his wife. "Mom, you have been pretty rigid about things," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Maybe you could be more flexible." That's when Jessica stepped closer to me, her eyes blazing with a hatred that shocked me. "I've had it with your passive-aggressive little comments and your precious routines," she snarled. "You want to know what I really think of you?" Then she spit directly in my face. The warm saliva hit my cheek and slowly dripped down. I stood there frozen, unable to process what had just happened. In my 62 years, no one had ever shown me such deliberate disrespect. I looked at David, waiting for him to say something, anything, to defend his mother. Instead, he shrugged. "Well, Mom, you kind of brought this on yourself. You've been making Jessica feel unwelcome since day one." Those words hit me harder than the spit. My own son was telling me I deserved to be humiliated in my own home. I wiped my face with a kitchen towel, set it on the counter, and without saying a word, went upstairs to my bedroom. I locked the door and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at nothing. 40 years I'd lived in this house, 40 years of memories with David's father. I'd raised David here, sacrificed for his education, supported his dreams, and this is what I got in return. But as I sat there in the darkness, something began to shift inside me. The hurt was transforming into something else, something colder and more purposeful. I had options they didn't know about, resources they'd never bothered to ask about, and patience they'd never tested before. By morning, I had a plan. I woke up before dawn and went straight to the kitchen. The smell of vanilla and cinnamon filled the house as I prepared the most elaborate breakfast I'd made in years. Pancakes, fresh fruit, bacon, sausage, hash browns, and my famous French toast. When David and Jessica came downstairs, their eyes widened at the feast spread across the dining room table. "Good," David said with satisfaction. "You finally understood your place." That's when they noticed I wasn't alone. The man sitting at my dining room table was wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit and eating my pancakes like he belonged there. When David and Jessica saw him, the color drained from their faces completely. "Mom," David stammered, "who is this?" "David, Jessica," I said pleasantly. "I'd like you to meet Thomas Richardson. He's a lawyer." Jessica dropped her coffee mug. The ceramic shattered on my hardwood floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. Thomas stood and extended his hand with the kind of professional courtesy that costs $500 an hour. "Pleased to meet you both. Your mother has told me so much about you." The way he said it made clear that what I'd told him wasn't flattering. "A lawyer?" Jessica's voice cracked. "What do you need a lawyer for?" "Margaret?" I love how she only calls me Margaret when she's scared. Usually I'm just Mom when she wants something. "Well, after last night's conversation, I realized I needed to make some adjustments to my estate planning," I said, buttering my toast with deliberate calm. Thomas specializes in situations like mine. What kind of situations? David was trying to sound casual, but I could see the panic in his eyes. Thomas opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder. Elder abuse situations. Your mother called me at 6 this morning describing what happened. Spitting on a senior citizen in their own home qualifies as assault under state law. Jessica went very still. I didn't assault anyone. It was just an argument that got heated. Bodily fluids constitute assault, Thomas replied matter-of-factly. But we're not here to discuss criminal charges. We're here to discuss your mother's will. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My will? I repeated. Oh yes, I've decided to make some significant changes. David sat down heavily. Mom, you're being dramatic. Jessica apologizes for last night, don't you, Jessica? But Jessica wasn't apologizing. She was staring at Thomas like he was a rattlesnake. What changes? She asked directly. Thomas pulled out several documents. Mrs. Williams currently has you and David listed as primary beneficiaries for this house, her savings accounts, and her life insurance policy. Approximately $1.2 million total. Had. Past tense. I watched that word land on them like a physical blow. However, Thomas continued, given recent developments, she's decided to explore other options for her legacy. Other options? David's voice was barely a whisper. Charitable organizations, I said cheerfully. The animal shelter has always been close to my heart, and there's a scholarship fund at the community college that could use support. Jessica found her voice. You can't do this. We're family. Family doesn't spit on family, I replied simply. Margaret, I apologize, Jessica said quickly. I was stressed. I wasn't thinking clearly. It won't happen again. Of course it won't, I agreed, because you're going to be moving out. The bombshell dropped perfectly. I'd been planning this conversation all night, and their reactions were exactly what I'd expected. Moving out? David stood up so fast, his chair tipped over. Mom, we can't afford to move out. You know our situation. I'm well aware of your situation, David. You've been unemployed for 6 months, and Jessica was fired from her last job for stealing office supplies. I wasn't stealing, Jessica protested. Those were just pens and paper. $47 worth of pens and paper, I corrected. I called your former boss yesterday. She had quite a lot to say about your work ethic. Thomas was watching this exchange with professional interest. He'd probably seen plenty of family dynamics like this one. You called my former boss? Jessica's voice was getting shrill. You had no right. I had every right to investigate the character of people living in my house, I said calmly. Especially people who assault me. One incident, David pleaded. Mom, you're willing to destroy our family over one incident? One incident? I set down my fork. David, in the 6 months you've lived here, you've contributed exactly $0 to household expenses. You've eaten my food, used my utilities, and treated me like hired help. The spitting was just the final insult. Thomas cleared his throat. Mrs. Williams, shall we discuss the timeline for the changes? What timeline? Jessica demanded. The new will goes into effect immediately, I explained, and I'll need you both to vacate the premises by the end of the week. David looked like he might cry. Where are we supposed to go? I suggest you figure that out quickly, Thomas said, closing his folder, because Mrs. Williams has also decided to change the locks on Friday. But I had one more surprise for them. Actually, I said, reaching for the envelope I'd placed beside my coffee cup, there is one way you could change my mind about all of this. David practically lunged for that envelope. Hope flickered in his eyes for the first time since Thomas had introduced himself. What do you mean? Jessica asked suspiciously. I opened the envelope slowly, savoring their desperate attention. Inside were 3 photographs I'd printed from my laptop that morning. Well, I was doing some cleaning yesterday, and I found something interesting in the basement storage room. The photos showed David's collection of vintage comic books, still in their protective sleeves, stacked neatly in boxes. Comics he'd told me were worthless and asked me to store just temporarily. Thomas leaned forward with interest. Are those what I think they are? First edition Amazing Fantasy number 15, I confirmed. The first appearance of Spider-Man. David's father bought it for him when he was 12. David's face went white. Mom, you didn't. Oh, I did. I pulled out my phone and showed them the eBay listing I'd created at 5 that morning. Current bid is at $8,000 and the auction doesn't end until Sunday. $8,000, Jessica gasped. That's just the opening bid, Thomas noted with admiration. A mint condition Amazing Fantasy 15 can sell for $20,000 or more. You can't sell my comics, David shouted. Those are mine. Are they? I asked innocently. Because when you moved them into my basement, you said they were just worthless old books you didn't want taking up space. I offered to throw them away, but you said to just stick them somewhere. This was true. David had dismissed his comic collection as kid stuff when he moved back in. He'd had no idea they'd become valuable. Besides, I continued, the storage room is in my house. Abandoned property laws are quite clear about items left on premises without an ownership agreement. Thomas nodded. Legally speaking, after 6 months without claim or payment of storage fees, the property transfers to the homeowner. Jessica was frantically calculating in her head. I could practically see the numbers spinning. $20,000 was more than they'd see in months. Margaret, she said carefully, perhaps we've all been too hasty here. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement. What kind of arrangement? I asked, though I already knew where this was going. Well, Jessica glanced at David. What if we paid rent, a fair amount for staying here? How much do you think would be fair? Thomas asked. I hadn't told him about this part of my plan, but he was playing along perfectly. $500 a month? David suggested hopefully. I laughed, actually laughed out loud. 500? David, this house is worth $1.2 million. Fair market rent would be at least $2,500. The hope died in his eyes. They couldn't afford that any more than they could afford their own place. However, I said, watching them closely, I might consider a different kind of arrangement. What kind? Jessica asked desperately. I pulled out a piece of paper I'd prepared. A formal contract. You can stay here rent-free for exactly 90 days while you find jobs and save for your own place. And in exchange? Thomas prompted. In exchange, you'll both attend family counseling with me once a week. You'll contribute to household expenses based on your actual income when you find work. And most importantly, you'll treat me with the respect I deserve as the owner of this home. It was a reasonable offer, more than reasonable, considering Jessica had assaulted me less than 12 hours ago. That sounds fair, David said quickly. I'm not finished. I held up my hand. There's also a penalty clause. Any disrespect, any arguments that escalate to violence, any damage to my property, and the agreement is void. You're out immediately with no further discussion. Jessica was reading over the contract. This is very specific. It has to be, Thomas explained. Clear boundaries prevent future misunderstandings. And if we sign this, you'll take the comics off eBay? David asked. I smiled. Oh no, I'm keeping those proceeds either way. Consider it back rent for the 6 months you've been freeloading. The silence stretched out while they processed this. I was giving them a chance to stay, but it was going to cost them their pride and David's childhood treasures. We need to discuss this privately, Jessica said finally. Of course, Thomas and I will be having coffee on the back patio. Take your time. As we walked outside, Thomas shook his head with admiration. You've backed them into a corner beautifully. They can't afford to leave, but they can't afford to stay on your terms either. They'll sign, I predicted. Jessica's too proud to admit defeat, and David's too scared to face the real world without me. And if they don't honor the agreement? I smiled, watching them through the kitchen window as they argued in hushed voices. Then I get my house back and they get nothing. Either way, I win. 20 minutes later, they came outside with the signed contract, but I could tell from Jessica's expression that she was already planning to break it. I was right about Jessica. She lasted exactly 11 days before she tested my new boundaries. It started small, like it always does with people who can't help themselves. She forgot to clean up after herself. She made passive-aggressive comments about the house rules. She started leaving little messes for me to find, testing to see if I'd enforce the contract. I documented everything. Photos of dirty dishes left in the sink, screenshots of text messages where she complained to her friends about living with her controlling mother-in-law, even recordings of her phone calls where she bad-mouthed me to anyone who would listen. Thomas had suggested I keep evidence, just in case. The The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I discovered she'd been going through my personal papers. I'd noticed things in my bedroom were slightly out of place for several days. A drawer not quite closed properly. My jewelry box positioned differently on the dresser. At first I thought I was being paranoid, but when I found my bank statements scattered on my desk instead of neatly filed where I'd left them, I knew. "Jessica," I called downstairs. "Could you come up here, please?" She appeared in my doorway with that fake innocent expression she wore when she'd been caught doing something wrong. "You wanted to see me?" I gestured to my desk. "Can you explain why my personal financial documents are all over my room?" "I don't know what you mean," but her eyes darted to the papers and back to me too quickly. My bank statements were filed in that folder. Now they're spread across my desk like someone was reading through them. "Maybe you forgot where you put them." It happens when people get older. There it was. The disrespect clause violation I'd been waiting for. "Jessica, are you suggesting I'm having memory problems?" "I'm just saying that maybe you're confused about where you left things." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I'd taken of my organized desk 2 days earlier. Time-stamped and dated. "These photos prove my papers were exactly where I said they were. Unless you're claiming I have memory problems about taking pictures too?" She realized she'd been caught. Her whole demeanor shifted from fake sweetness to open hostility. "Fine. I was looking at your bank statements. Do you know how frustrating it is to be broke while living with someone who has hundreds of thousands of dollars just sitting in accounts? So you decided to invade my privacy and go through my personal financial information?" "I needed to know what we were dealing with. David's been talking about asking you for money for a business idea, and I wanted to see if you could actually afford it." This was getting more interesting by the minute. "What business idea?" "He wants to start a landscaping company. He needs about $30,000 for equipment and a truck." $30,000. They'd been planning to ask me for $30,000 while contributing nothing to the household and treating me like an inconvenience. "And you thought going through my private papers would help with that request?" "I thought it would help me understand whether you were really as tight with money as you pretend to be, or if you're just being mean." That was it. The contract violation was clear and documented. "Jessica, you need to pack your things." "What?" "You violated the respect clause of our agreement. You're out." She laughed. Actually laughed. "You can't kick me out for looking at some papers. That's ridiculous." I held up my phone. "I've been recording this entire conversation. You just admitted to going through my private financial documents without permission and insulted my character in the process." The laughter died. "You were recording me? It's my house. I'm allowed to record conversations in my own home." She stood there sputtering for a moment before finding her voice. "David won't let you do this to me. David signed the same contract you did. He's bound by the same terms. We'll see about that." She stormed downstairs, shouting for David. I followed at a calmer pace, already knowing how this conversation would go. David would try to negotiate. Jessica would demand he choose sides, and I would remind them both that contracts have consequences. "David!" Jessica's voice echoed through the house. "Your mother has lost her mind. She's trying to kick me out for looking at some stupid papers." David emerged from the living room where he'd been watching television all morning instead of job hunting. "What's going on?" "Your wife violated our agreement," I said simply. "She went through my private financial documents without permission and then insulted me when I confronted her about it." David looked between us, and I could see him calculating. His wife or his housing situation, his marriage or his comfortable life living off his mother. "Mom, maybe we could work this out. Jessica, apologize to my mother." "I'm not apologizing for anything. She's the one who set up this ridiculous contract with all these impossible rules." "The rules aren't impossible," I pointed out. "You just have to treat me with basic respect. Apparently, that's beyond your capabilities." David was sweating now. "Jessica, just say you're sorry and promise not to go through Mom's things anymore." "No, I won't be controlled and manipulated by someone who's using her money to make us dance like puppets." And that's when David made his choice. "Jessica, stop." David's voice was firmer than I'd heard it in months. "Just stop talking." She turned on him with fury. "Are you seriously taking her side right now?" "I'm taking the side of having a roof over our heads," he snapped. "Do you have any idea how good we have it here? Free housing, free food, no responsibilities except being decent human beings?" Decent human beings? Jessica's voice rose to a shriek. She's treating us like servants in our own home. It's not our home, David finally exploded. It's her house, her food, her electricity, her everything. And instead of being grateful, you're acting like we're entitled to it. I watched this exchange with fascination. This was the first time I'd seen David stand up to his wife about anything. Grateful? Jessica was practically foaming. Grateful for what? Being treated like children? Having to ask permission to rearrange a kitchen? Living under a microscope with someone who documents every little thing we do wrong? Yes! David shouted. Grateful for all of that. Because without my mother's generosity, we'd be sleeping in your car. That stopped her cold. They'd never told me they'd lost their car, but apparently their financial situation was even worse than I'd realized. We wouldn't be sleeping in my car, she said quietly, because I sold my car 3 months ago to pay our credit card bills. The room fell silent. Even I was shocked by this revelation. You sold your car? David stared at her. When? Why didn't you tell me? Because I was trying to handle our problems without running to Mommy for help. By going through my mother's private papers instead? Jessica deflated slightly. I was desperate, David. We're $30,000 in debt. We have no income and no prospects. When you mentioned wanting to start a business, I thought maybe if I knew how much money your mother had, you thought you'd figure out the best way to manipulate me into giving it to you, I finished. She didn't deny it. David sat down heavily on the couch. 30,000 in debt? Jessica, what haven't you told me? The credit cards, the student loans, the personal loan my mother co-signed for my business idea that failed. What business idea? The one I tried to start last year. The online boutique? I maxed out our cards buying inventory that never sold. I was learning more about their financial situation in this 5-minute argument than I had in 6 months of living with them. So let me understand this, I said calmly. You're 30,000 in debt, you've sold your car, you have no income, and you thought the solution was to go through my private papers to figure out how to convince me to give you more money? When you put it like that, it sounds bad, Jessica mumbled. It doesn't just sound bad, it is bad. I pulled out the signed contract. And more importantly, it's a violation of our agreement. David looked defeated. Mom, please, don't make us leave. We literally have nowhere to go. You should have thought about that before your wife decided to snoop through my bedroom. I'll make it right, David promised. I'll get a job, any job. I'll pay rent. I'll make Jessica apologize properly. David, no, Jessica started, but he cut her off. Jessica, either you apologize to my mother right now, or we're both homeless. Your choice. She stared at him like she'd never seen him before. You're choosing her over me? I'm choosing survival over pride, he replied. Something you might want to consider. Jessica looked between us, her face cycling through anger, disbelief, and finally resignation. She turned to me with the most insincere expression I'd ever seen. Margaret, I apologize for going through your personal papers. It was wrong of me, and I promise it won't happen again. And? David prompted. And I'm sorry for being disrespectful to you in your own home. I studied her face. The apology was forced, but at least it was an apology. Thank you, Jessica. I accept your apology. David exhaled in relief. So we can stay? I folded the contract carefully and put it in my pocket. You can stay on one condition. What condition? Jessica asked suspiciously. David, you'll start a job search today. Not a business plan, not a scheme to get money from me, but an actual job search. Retail, food service, whatever you can find. Done, he agreed immediately. And Jessica, since you're so interested in my financial situation, you're going to help me organize my paperwork. Under supervision, of course. She winced. Organize your paperwork? All of it. Tax documents, bank statements, insurance policies, investment accounts. You'll learn exactly what my financial situation is, but you'll do it legitimately. Is that supposed to be punishment? I smiled. Oh no, Jessica. That's supposed to be education. Because once you see the reality of my finances, you'll understand why I'm so careful about how I spend my money. What do you mean? I mean my hundreds of thousands of dollars might not be quite what you think it is. David and Jessica exchanged glances. They were about to learn that their assumptions about my wealth were wildly inaccurate, but they wouldn't learn the whole truth until much later. Jessica's education about my finances began the next morning in my home office. I'd prepared several filing boxes and a detailed spreadsheet for organizing my documents. "We'll start with tax returns," I announced, handing her a stack of papers. "Last 5 years should be sufficient." She sat down reluctantly and began sorting through the documents. Within an hour, her attitude had changed completely. "Margaret," she said slowly, "according to these tax returns, your income is only about $40,000 a year from Social Security and your pension. That's correct. But the bank statements showed hundreds of thousands in savings accounts. Those would be the proceeds from selling your father-in-law's business after he died." David looked up from his laptop where he'd been half-heartedly job searching. "Dad's business? I thought it was just a small accounting firm." "It was. But small doesn't mean worthless. Your father spent 30 years building relationships with local businesses. When he died, I sold the client list and office lease to a larger firm." "How much did you get?" Jessica asked. I pulled out the purchase agreement. $200,000 after taxes and legal fees. David whistled. "I had no idea it was worth that much. Most people don't understand the value of a well-established service business," I explained. "But Jessica, keep reading through those statements. You'll notice something interesting about the balances over time." She flipped through several months of bank statements, her frown deepening. "The balances keep going down." "Exactly. When you're living on a fixed income and drawing from savings, the money doesn't last forever." "How long will it last?" David asked quietly. I pulled out a financial planning worksheet I'd prepared with Thomas's help. "At my current rate of spending, approximately 12 years. Less if I need long-term care or have major medical expenses." The reality was sinking in. I wasn't a wealthy widow with unlimited resources. I was a retiree trying to make my modest savings last for the rest of my life. "But the house," Jessica protested. "It's worth over $1 million. It's worth that if I sell it. But if I sell it, where do I live? Comparable housing would cost me $3,000 a month in rent, which would drain my savings in 4 years instead of 12. David closed his laptop. "Mom, I never realized. I thought you were comfortable." "I am comfortable, as long as I'm careful. But supporting 2 additional adults indefinitely would change that calculation significantly." Jessica was staring at the financial projections. "So when you said you couldn't afford to support us, I meant it literally. If I paid for your housing, food, and expenses for more than a few months, it would threaten my own financial security." This was mostly true. I was being conservative with my calculations, but the basic math was sound. Supporting David and Jessica long-term would impact my finances. What I wasn't telling them was that I had additional resources they didn't know about. "I'm sorry," David said suddenly. "I never thought about it from your perspective. I just assumed that since you owned the house, you assumed I was wealthy because I have assets. But assets and cash flow are different things." Jessica was still studying the bank statements. "What about this investment account? The one with Richardson Financial?" I tensed slightly. She'd found the one account I'd hoped she wouldn't notice. "That's my emergency fund. It's managed by a financial advisor to protect it from inflation." "How much is in it?" "That's not relevant to our current discussion." "It shows quarterly dividends of about $3,000, she pressed. "That suggests a significant principal balance." David was paying attention now. "Mom, how much is in the investment account?" I could have lied. Should have, probably. But I'd been caught off guard by Jessica's attention to detail. "About 400,000. The silence that followed was deafening. 400,000? David's voice cracked. "Mom, that changes everything." "No, it doesn't. But with that money, I could afford to destroy my retirement security to enable your lack of responsibility," I finished. "That account is untouchable. It's what will pay for my care when I'm too old to live independently." Jessica set down the papers. "So you do have money. You've been playing poor this whole time. I've been playing realistic. There's a difference. You let us think you were barely getting by. You never asked about my finances until you decided to snoop through my papers." David was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. $600,000 in total savings, plus the house. "Mom, you're worth over $1 million. On paper. But I'm 70 years old with no income beyond Social Security. $1 million has to last me for potentially 20 more years. That's $50,000 a year," Jessica calculated quickly. "Plus Social Security. You could live very comfortably on that, unless I need assisted living, which costs $60,000 a year, or memory care, which costs $90,000, or long-term medical care, which could cost even more. They were both quiet, processing this information. So you're not poor, David said finally, but you're not rich either. I'm financially secure if I'm careful and don't have any major surprises. Like supporting unemployed adult children, Jessica added quietly. Exactly. But even as we had this conversation, I was thinking about the phone call I'd received that morning from my real financial advisor, the one who managed accounts Jessica had never seen, the call that was about to change everything again. My phone rang during lunch, interrupting what had become a surprisingly civil conversation about household budgets and job search strategies. Margaret Williams speaking. Mrs. Williams, this is Patricia Sullivan from Henley & Associates. I have some news about your father's estate that requires immediate attention. I stepped away from the table, but not so far that David and Jessica couldn't hear. My father's estate was settled 15 years ago, Patricia. That's what we thought. But we've discovered an error in the original probate filing. There's an asset that was never properly transferred. David and Jessica had stopped eating and were watching me with obvious interest. What kind of asset? A commercial property in downtown Portland. Your father apparently owned it through a subsidiary company that wasn't identified during the estate proceedings. The current tenants have been paying rent to an escrow account for 15 years. How much rent? Approximately $4,000 per month. The escrow account currently holds over $700,000 in accumulated rental payments. I gripped the phone tighter. $700,000. Money that legally belonged to me, but that I'd never known existed. Mrs. Williams? Are you there? I'm here. What do I need to do? We need you to come to our office to sign the transfer documents. The property and the escrow funds will be transferred to you immediately. I'll be there this afternoon. I hung up and turned around to find David and Jessica staring at me with wide eyes. $700,000, David whispered. It appears so. Jessica stood up abruptly. Margaret, this changes everything. With that money, you could— I could what? I asked curiously. You could help us get back on our feet. You could loan us the money for David's business. I sat back down at the table and continued eating my sandwich. Could I? Mom, David said urgently. This is like winning the lottery. That's enough money to solve all our problems. All of whose problems? Our problems. The family's problems. I took another bite and chewed thoughtfully. David, what exactly are your problems? You know what they are. We're in debt. We don't have jobs. We don't have a place to live. Those sound like your problems, not family problems. Jessica leaned forward. Margaret, be reasonable. This is an opportunity for all of us to benefit. You don't need all that money just sitting in an account. Don't I? You just told us you have enough saved for retirement. This is extra money. Found money. I set down my sandwich. Jessica, let me ask you something. If you found $700,000, would your first thought be to give it to someone else? That's different. How is it different? Because we're family. Family helps family. Family, I repeated. Jessica, what have you contributed to this family since you've been here? I've been trying to find work. You've been sleeping until noon and complaining about my house rules. That's not the same thing. David jumped in. Mom, that's not fair. We're both trying. Are you? David, you've applied for exactly 3 jobs in 6 months. All of them were positions you considered beneath you. I don't want to waste my education working retail. But you're willing to waste my retirement savings avoiding work entirely? The truth was crystallizing for both of them. They'd spent 6 months treating me like their personal ATM, and now they wanted access to even more money. Look, Jessica said, trying a different approach. What if we made this a business arrangement? You could invest in David's landscaping company and we'd pay you back with interest. What's David's business plan? We haven't written it up yet, but what's his experience in landscaping? He's always been good with yard work. What's his market research? Market research? Who are his potential customers? What services will he offer? What are his startup costs beyond equipment? What's his projected timeline for profitability? Jessica's silence was telling. You want me to invest $30,000 in a business that exists only in David's imagination, run by someone with no relevant experience, with no business plan, no market research, and no timeline for success. When you put it like that, I'm putting it accurately. And that's exactly the kind of financial decision that would turn my found money into lost money. David looked desperate. Mom, what would it take for you to consider helping us? I stood up and began clearing the table. Show me you can help yourselves first. What do you mean? Get jobs. Any jobs. Show me you can earn money and manage it responsibly. Develop an actual business plan with research and projections. Prove that you're worth investing in. How long would that take? Jessica asked. However long it takes. But we need help now. You needed help 6 months ago. You've had half a year to figure this out. And instead, you've been living off my generosity while planning to ask me for more money. I gathered the dishes and headed for the kitchen, leaving them sitting at the table in stunned silence. But what I didn't tell them was that I was going to Portland that afternoon for a very different reason than signing paperwork. The meeting at Henley & Associates was everything I'd hoped it would be. Patricia Sullivan was a sharp woman in her 50s who had clearly been dealing with complicated estate issues for decades. Mrs. Williams, I have to say, this is one of the most unusual cases I've handled. Your father was quite the businessman. She spread out the documents across her conference table. The property was a small office building with 3 commercial tenants. The escrow account contained exactly $743,000. However, Patricia continued, there's something else you should know about this property. What's that? One of the tenants is facing financial difficulties. They're 3 months behind on rent and have asked about purchasing the building. Purchasing it? They've made a preliminary offer of $1.8 million. I set down the papers I'd been reading. $1.8 million, plus the accumulated rent money, over $2.5 million total. Mrs. Williams, are you all right? I'm fine. Just processing the magnitude of this discovery. There's one more thing. The purchase offer comes with a condition that the sale close within 60 days. Apparently, the tenant company is expanding rapidly and needs to secure permanent space quickly. And if I don't sell, they'll find another location and terminate their lease. Since they're your largest tenant, that would significantly reduce the property's value and rental income. I leaned back in my chair. This wasn't just found money. This was a decision that would impact the rest of my life. I need some time to think about this. Of course. But Mrs. Williams, can I speak frankly? Please do. At your age, having liquid assets is generally preferable to managing rental property. The sale would give you complete financial independence for the rest of your life. She was right. With that money properly invested, I'd never have to worry about finances again. I could even afford to help David and Jessica if I chose to. The question was whether they deserved that help. I drove home with the signed transfer documents and a cashier's check for $743,000 in my purse. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd made my decision about the property sale. But first, I wanted to see what David and Jessica had done with their afternoon. I found them exactly where I'd left them. David was back on his laptop, but instead of job searching, he was researching landscaping equipment. Jessica was making lists of business names and logo ideas. How did the meeting go? David asked when I walked in. The property is mine, and the money is in my account. That's wonderful, Jessica exclaimed. So you can help us get started. I sat down across from them. Actually, I have an opportunity to sell the property for $1.8 million. Their mouths fell open simultaneously. $1.8 million? David whispered. Plus the rental money, it would be about $2.5 million total. Jessica was practically vibrating with excitement. Margaret, this is incredible. We could all be set for life. I could be set for life, I corrected. This is my inheritance. But family, David started. Yes, let's talk about family, I interrupted. David, what did you accomplish this afternoon while I was claiming my inheritance? He gestured to his laptop. I've been researching commercial lawnmowers and you've been shopping for equipment for a business that doesn't exist instead of looking for work that could actually provide income. I was planning. You were fantasizing. Jessica, what about you? She showed me her notebook. I've been working on branding concepts and more fantasizing. I closed her notebook. Neither of you spent a single minute this afternoon doing anything that would actually improve your situation. We were planning our future, Jessica protested. You were planning to spend my money. There's a difference. David leaned forward desperately. Mom, with $2.5 million, you could afford to invest in our future. It would barely make a dent in your wealth. Could I afford it? Yes. Should I invest in people who won't even look for jobs while living in my house rent-free? Absolutely not. You're being cruel, Jessica said. I'm being practical. And I've made a decision about the property sale. They both held their breath. I'm accepting the offer, but there's a condition attached to how that money gets used. What condition? David asked. I pulled out my phone and showed them the rental listing I'd found during my drive home. It's a lovely 2-bedroom apartment about 20 minutes from here. Available immediately. You want us to rent an apartment? Jessica's voice was flat. I want you to become independent adults. The lease is in your names. First month's rent paid by me as a move-out gift. And after that? After that, you support yourselves like every other married couple in America. David stared at the apartment listing. Mom, we can't afford this on our own. Then you'd better find jobs quickly. What if we can't find work in time to make the rent? I smiled. Then you'll learn what real financial pressure feels like. And maybe that will motivate you in ways that my generosity never could. But I wasn't finished with my surprises yet. The apartment viewing was scheduled for Thursday morning. I insisted on driving David and Jessica there myself, ostensibly to help them evaluate the space, but really to make sure they couldn't back out at the last minute. The apartment was perfect for them. 2 bedrooms, modern kitchen, washer and dryer connections. The rent was $1,500 a month, which would require both of them to work but wasn't impossible to manage. It's nice, David admitted reluctantly as we walked through the living room. The kitchen is bigger than I expected, Jessica added, though her tone suggested she was looking for reasons to reject it. The property manager, a woman named Carol, was explaining the lease terms when my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Thomas Richardson. Important development. Can you call me immediately? I excused myself and stepped outside to return his call. Margaret, we need to meet today. Something significant has happened with your case. What case? I'm not involved in any legal case. You are now. Jessica's former employer filed a criminal complaint against her for embezzlement. The police want to interview you as a witness. My blood went cold. Embezzlement! I thought she was fired for stealing office supplies. That was apparently the tip of the iceberg. They've discovered she forged purchase orders and invoiced fake vendors for almost $50,000 over 6 months. $50,000. No wonder they were so deeply in debt. Thomas, what does this mean for me? Since Jessica has been living in your house, they'll want to verify you weren't involved. And Margaret, there's something else. What? They've also opened an investigation into David's unemployment benefits. Apparently, he's been claiming to look for work while receiving payments, but there's no record of actual job applications. Benefit fraud. Both of them were potentially facing criminal charges. How bad is this? Jessica could be looking at felony charges. David's situation is less serious, but still problematic. Margaret, you need to distance yourself from their legal problems immediately. I looked through the window at David and Jessica, who were still discussing the apartment with Carol. They had no idea their past was about to catch up with them. I'll call you back in an hour, I told Thomas and went back inside. So what do you think? I asked brightly. We'll take it, David said. Jessica shot him a surprised look, but he was apparently ready to commit to independence. Excellent, Carol said. I'll need first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. $4,500 total. I pulled out my checkbook. I'll cover the first month's rent as promised. You two will need to handle the rest. The rest? Jessica's voice cracked. We don't have $3,000. Then I guess you'd better figure out how to get it quickly, I said, continuing to write the check. The apartment won't hold itself. David was panicking. Mom, we can't come up with that kind of money by ourselves. Sure you can. You have until tomorrow to make this work. I handed Carol the check for $1,500. This holds the apartment for 24 hours, correct? Correct. They have until tomorrow at noon to bring the balance, or the apartment goes to the next applicant. As we drove home, David and Jessica were arguing frantically about where to find $3,000. We could sell something, Jessica suggested. Sell what? We don't own anything valuable. We could ask friends for loans. What friends? We've already borrowed money from everyone we know. I listened to their desperation with growing satisfaction. This was the real-world pressure they'd needed all along. There is one option, I said casually as we pulled into my driveway. What option? David asked eagerly. You could get jobs. Today. Any jobs. Even minimum wage work would get you enough money for the deposit if you could both start immediately. Nobody pays on the first day, Jessica protested. Restaurants do. Construction companies do. Cleaning services do. You've just been too proud to consider those kinds of jobs. Mom, please. Just loan us the money and we'll pay you back. With what income? You still haven't solved the fundamental problem of having jobs. I parked the car and turned to face them. David, Jessica, I need to tell you something important. What? The police called while we were looking at the apartment. The color drained from both their faces. What did they want? Jessica whispered. They want to interview me about some irregularities in your former employment records. Jessica started crying. David just stared at me in horror. How much trouble are we in? He asked quietly. That depends on how honest you've been with me about your situations. We told you the truth, Jessica sobbed. I shook my head sadly. Jessica, embezzling $50,000 is not the same as taking office supplies. She looked like she might faint. And David, claiming unemployment benefits while not actually looking for work, is fraud. Who told you that? He demanded. People talk, David. This is a small town. Actually, Thomas had excellent sources at both the police department and the unemployment office. But they didn't need to know that. What happens now? Jessica asked through her tears. Now you decide whether you want to face these problems as independent adults with their own apartment or as unemployed criminals living with their mother. The choice was stark and clear, and it was about to get even more complicated. The next morning, I woke up to find David and Jessica already dressed and sitting at my kitchen table with what looked like a serious conversation in progress. Good morning, I said, pouring my coffee. Did you figure out how to handle the apartment deposit? We need to tell you something, David said nervously. I'm listening. Jessica took a deep breath. Last night, we applied for jobs at 6 different places: fast food, retail, a cleaning company, anything that would hire us immediately. This was unexpected. And 3 places called us back for interviews today, David continued. But Mom, even if we both get hired, we won't have enough money for the deposit by noon. I sat down at the table. So what are you asking me? We're not asking for anything, Jessica said quietly. We're going to tell Carol we can't take the apartment. And then what? We'd like to stay here for 30 more days while we work and save money for a place we can actually afford. David nodded. We'll pay you rent from our first paychecks, whatever you think is fair. I studied their faces. Something had changed overnight. The desperation was gone, replaced by what looked like actual determination. What happened to change your minds? Jessica glanced at David, then back at me. We stayed up all night talking about our situation. Really talking, not just complaining or planning how to spend your money. And we realized that everything you've been saying is true, David admitted. We've been acting like entitled children instead of adults. The police investigation scared you. Yes, Jessica said honestly. But it also made us realize that we can't keep running from our problems. Whether we're living here or in that apartment, we still have to face what we've done. This was the most mature conversation I'd had with either of them since they'd moved in. So you want to stay here and work on becoming independent? If you'll let us, David said, with real jobs, paying real rent, following the house rules without complaint. I sipped my coffee, considering this development. The truth was, I'd grown somewhat fond of having people in the house again, despite the drama. And if they were actually working and contributing, what about the business plan? The landscaping company? Maybe someday, David said. But first, I need to prove I can hold down a regular job and manage money responsibly. And Jessica, what about your legal problems? Thomas Richardson recommended a criminal defense attorney. I have an appointment this afternoon to discuss my options. She was facing her problems instead of running from them. That was progress. I have a counter-proposal, I said finally. They both tensed. You can stay here for 90 days while you get established in your jobs. You'll pay me $500 a month in rent once you start receiving paychecks. That's very reasonable, David said gratefully. I'm not finished. In exchange for this arrangement, you'll both attend financial literacy classes at the community college. You'll put 20% of your earnings into savings accounts that I'll help you set up. And Jessica, you'll cooperate fully with the police investigation and make restitution for whatever you're found to have stolen. Agreed, Jessica said immediately. And, I continued, when the 90 days are up, you'll move to your own place whether you think you're ready or not. No extensions, no negotiations. Understood, David nodded. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden their father and I had planted together 30 years ago. There's one more thing I haven't told you about the property sale. What's that? Jessica asked. I turned back to face them. I'm not keeping all the money. What do you mean? I'm putting $2 million into conservative investments for my retirement, but the other $500,000 is going into a trust fund. David's eyes widened. A trust fund for what? For my grandchildren's education. And if you two can prove you're capable of managing money responsibly, there might be something left for you someday. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. This one was full of possibility instead of tension. Mom, David said finally, we won't let you down. See that you don't, because this is the last chance you'll get from me. Jessica stood up. I should get ready for my job interview. What position are you interviewing for? Night shift at the grocery store, stocking shelves. That's honest work? Yes, she said simply. It is. As they left for their interviews, I called Thomas to update him on the situation. You're giving them another chance? He asked. I'm giving them the opportunity to earn another chance. There's a difference. And if they fail again? Then they'll fail as independent adults living somewhere else, not as dependents living in my house. That's fair. Thomas, there's something else I want to discuss with you. What's that? I want to update my will again. More changes? I looked around my kitchen, seeing it not as a museum of the past, but as a place where new memories could still be made. I want to make sure that kindness is rewarded and selfishness has consequences. Can you help me structure that legally? Margaret, Thomas said with admiration in his voice, I think we can create exactly the incentives you want. 6 months later, David was promoted to assistant manager at the hardware store, where he'd started as a stock clerk. Jessica completed her community service and was working full-time as a bookkeeper, having earned her employer's trust despite her past mistakes. They moved into their own apartment exactly 90 days after our agreement, as promised. And when I got the call from the hospital 3 years later, it was David who dropped everything to drive me to my appointment, and Jessica, who brought me homemade soup while I recovered. Sometimes the best gifts you can give people are the ones they have to earn themselves. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.
Trước khi khép lại câu chuyện này, mình muốn bạn ở lại với mình thêm một chút, như một cuộc trò chuyện thực sự, không vội vàng, không kịch bản. Đôi khi mình nghĩ điều đặc biệt nhất của những câu chuyện như thế này không phải là cao trào, không phải là cái kết, mà là những cảm xúc còn đọng lại sau khi mọi thứ đã kết thúc. Bạn có bao giờ xem xong một câu chuyện rồi tự nhiên im lặng vài giây không? Không phải vì không có gì để nói, mà là vì có quá nhiều thứ đang chạy trong đầu. Mình thì có. Và mỗi lần như vậy mình lại tự hỏi ngoài kia có bao nhiêu câu chuyện giống như thế này mà chúng ta chưa từng được nghe. Bao nhiêu con người đã trải qua những điều khó khăn như vậy nhưng không có ai kể lại. Bao nhiêu người phụ nữ đã phải mạnh mẽ trong im lặng mà không ai thực sự nhìn thấy. Đó là điều khiến mình luôn suy nghĩ rất nhiều sau mỗi video. Bởi vì sự mạnh mẽ không phải lúc nào cũng ồn ào. Nó không phải lúc nào cũng là những khoảnh khắc đứng trên sân khấu hay những chiến thắng rõ ràng để mọi người vỗ tay. Đôi khi sự mạnh mẽ chỉ đơn giản là thức dậy vào mỗi buổi sáng khi bạn không còn chút năng lượng nào, tiếp tục cố gắng khi mọi thứ dường như đang chống đối lại bạn, mỉm cười dù bên trong bạn đang rất mệt mỏi. Và điều đặc biệt là rất nhiều người phụ nữ ngoài kia đang làm điều đó mỗi ngày. Không ai biết, không ai hỏi, nhưng họ vẫn tiếp tục. Những nhân vật trong câu chuyện bạn vừa xem có thể là hư cấu, nhưng cảm xúc của họ thì không hề hư cấu. Nỗi đau là sự thật, sự tổn thương là thật, và cả sự kiên cường cũng là thật. Đó là lý do tại sao mình luôn muốn kể những câu chuyện như thế này. Không phải để làm mọi thứ trở nên buồn hơn, mà để chúng ta có thể hiểu hơn, Hiểu rằng đằng sau mỗi con người là cả một hành trình mà chúng ta không thể nhìn thấy. Hiểu rằng đôi khi sự im lặng của một người không phải là họ yếu đuối, mà là họ đã phải chịu đựng quá nhiều. Và hiểu rằng sự vươn lên không phải lúc nào cũng hoàn hảo. Có những lần họ sẽ gục ngã, có những lúc họ sẽ nghi ngờ chính mình, có những khoảnh khắc họ muốn từ bỏ tất cả. Nhưng rồi họ vẫn đứng dậy, không phải vì họ không sợ, mà là vì họ không còn lựa chọn nào khác ngoài việc phải tiếp tục. Và mình nghĩ đó mới là định nghĩa thực sự của sức mạnh. Không phải là không bao giờ yếu đuối, mà là vẫn bước tiếp, ngay cả khi bạn đang yếu đuối nhất. Có thể khi nghe đến đây, bạn sẽ thấy câu chuyện này không chỉ là về một nhân vật nữa, mà là về rất nhiều con người. Có thể là một người bạn của bạn, một người thân trong gia đình, hoặc thậm chí là chính bạn. Và nếu bạn từng trải qua những cảm xúc tương tự, thì mình muốn bạn biết một điều: bạn không hề đơn độc. Có thể câu chuyện của bạn chưa được kể, có thể không ai thực sự hiểu hết những gì bạn đã đi qua, nhưng điều đó không làm cho những gì bạn trải qua trở nên ít quan trọng hơn. Ngược lại, nó càng cho thấy bạn đã mạnh mẽ như thế nào để đi đến đây. Và đó cũng là lý do mình luôn hy vọng khi bạn xem được những video này, bạn không chỉ xem để giải trí, mà bạn sẽ cảm nhận, bạn sẽ dừng lại một chút để nghĩ, để nhìn mọi thứ chậm lại, để hiểu hơn về con người và về chính mình. Bởi vì đôi khi một câu chuyện có thể không thay đổi cả thế giới, nhưng nó có thể thay đổi cách bạn nhìn nhận về thế giới. Và như thế đã là rất đủ rồi. Nếu bạn đã đi cùng mình đến tận đây, thật sự mình rất trân trọng điều đó. Không phải ai cũng có đủ kiên nhẫn để lắng nghe đến tận giây phút cuối cùng. Và việc bạn vẫn ở đây có nghĩa là câu chuyện này đã chạm đến bạn, dù chỉ một chút. Nếu bạn muốn, bạn có thể tiếp tục đồng hành cùng mình trong những video tiếp theo. Vẫn sẽ là những câu chuyện như thế này. Những câu chuyện có thể sẽ khiến bạn suy nghĩ nhiều hơn, có thể khiến bạn cảm thấy nặng lòng, nhưng cũng có thể mang lại cho bạn một góc nhìn khác. Và trước khi kết thúc, mình chỉ muốn nói một điều thôi. Đôi khi cuộc sống sẽ không công bằng, đôi khi mọi thứ sẽ xảy ra theo cách mà bạn không thể kiểm soát. Nhưng điều bạn luôn có thể kiểm soát là việc bạn chọn đứng dậy như thế nào sau tất cả. Dù chậm cũng được, dù mệt cũng được, chỉ cần bạn vẫn bước tiếp thì bạn đã mạnh mẽ hơn bạn nghĩ rất nhiều rồi. Cảm ơn vì các bạn đã ở đây, đã lắng nghe và đã cùng mình đi qua những câu chuyện này. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn trong những câu chuyện tiếp theo. Bye!